Hey there, I got the Nikon ZF and the 40 f2, and as most of you probably know, this is a fantastic street photography camera, but as you probably also know, I don't do much photography, so I'm out here getting some street video here in Durham, North Carolina, and in this video, I'm gonna give you my first impressions for using this camera for video. All right, so I'm back here in the studio and hopefully you enjoyed all that footage because I had a great time out shooting in Durham this morning with the Nikon ZF. If you're curious about the baseball stadium at the end of the footage there, that's actually the original stadium for the Durham Bulls, our AAA baseball team. And if you've seen the movie Bull Durham, that's where it takes place. So hopefully you see that movie, great movie. All right, before we get into the rest of the video, huge thank you to B&H Photo who lent me the Nikon ZF to test review and make videos like this for all of you. If you are looking to pick up some camera gear, I highly recommend you check out B&H. That's where I buy most of my stuff from. There are links in the description for the Nikon ZF and all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So big thank you to B&H Photo for making videos like this possible. Now, I don't have a lot of experience shooting with Nikon cameras. I did recently get a chance to test out the Nikon Z8 and I made some technical videos about it, but I don't have a lot of experience with it. So I was really excited to get my hands on the ZF and get out and shoot with it. So this is a first impressions video. This is not a review. That will come later. And so really the best way for me to get a sense of a camera is I just go out and shoot with it, which is what I did this morning. I got to capture a whole bunch of footage, go home and grade it, put it together so I can take a look and see what's going on with the image. I also get a good sense of the usability and the design of the camera because I actually go out and shoot with the camera. And I also really like to share images with all of you so you can see what the camera is capable of doing. So let's get on to talking about the image. The only way I can describe the image is it's really pretty. It's really pleasant. I really like the Nikon colors. Like I said, don't have a lot of experience with Nikon, but I was really impressed with just the image coming out of this camera. It was just really easy to work. So I shot everything in the 4K H.265 10-bit in N-Log, and that's a 6K oversampled 4K. The N-Log was really easy to grade. In Resolve, I just added a color space transform to convert it from Rec 2020 N-Log to Rec 709 N-Log, and then I just graded it. It had quite a bit of contrast and saturation already, but it was very easy to grade, and the image looked great just pretty quickly. So like I said, great image quality. I think the dynamic range looks really good, and the colors were really pleasing. I will get into testing more on in this camera, but just overall, it looked really good. One thing that got me really excited about this camera is the design of the camera. This is unlike any other camera that I have. It's very reminiscent of a vintage camera, an SLR. For me personally, I have shot analog film back in the day when there weren't digital cameras, and this definitely has that feel to it. And for me, this camera really feels more like a fun camera. And what do I mean by that? This camera doesn't feel like work. Now, I own cinema cameras, high-end mirrorless cameras, and when I take those cameras out to just go shooting with or have fun or try to be creative with it, they just feel like work, and I often don't want to grab them. This camera has a very different feel to it, a very different design, and when I was out shooting with it today, it was just a whole bunch of fun. So this does not feel like a work camera to me. In terms of the stabilization, I think it worked really well on the ZF. It has IBIS in the camera, and most of the footage was pretty stable with this 40mm lens. I don't think this lens is stabilized, but I did add a little bit of stabilization in post to some of the clips, but some of them didn't really need it, and it worked really well. I do have to mention also, when I'm doing street video, most of the time I'm using the EVF and I'm holding it up to my eye like this so I can see through the EVF, because outside it's really bright. Also gives me a third point of contact against my face and get a little bit more stable of a shot. Like I said, I was really happy with the stabilization. In terms of the LCD and the EVF, no real complaints. Like I said, I used the EVF most of the time when I was out shooting like this, but I also was able to use the LCD and flip it out like this and, you know, film low angles and stuff like that, and it worked well. I could definitely see it outside, so no real complaints about that. Mostly shooting in manual focus. In fact, I think I shot everything today in manual focus. It's kind of a habit I've gotten into lately. Once you start shooting manual focus, it's kind of hard to go back because you can just tell the camera exactly what you want it to do. And for that, I was using focus peaking, and it worked pretty well. The lens on here is the 40mm f2. This is one of the kit lenses that is available for the ZF. I think it fits the camera really, really well. The aesthetic, the feel, the ergonomics, and also just the usability of it. I think it's a really good fit for it. It's just a lot of fun. When I took this out, this was basically the whole package that I had with an ND filter on the front, and it looks small and conspicuous, and I think it just worked really, really well. And all the footage that you saw early on the video was shot with this combination. A couple of things I want to mention about my experience using the Nikon ZF this morning. First of all is the exposure. So there are two exposure tools in this camera. There's a histogram and a waveform, which is fantastic. I decided to use the histogram because it was just a little bit easier to see and judge, but it's really cool. They also include a waveform. Now, when I'm shooting in a log profile and when I'm shooting outside in daylight in a bright situation, what I like to do is I expose as high as I possibly can without clipping, and then I just back it down just a little bit to be safe. That way I capture as much light as possible, and the sensor can get as much information as I can, giving me cleaner shadows and just capturing as much of the scene as I can. So when I was doing this on the ZF and I was using the histogram to judge exposure, I would do the same thing. I'd raise the exposure till just before I clipped and then back it down a little bit. But what I noticed when I was looking at the EVF, especially the EVF, and maybe a little bit less so on the LCD, is that it looked way overexposed. So I freaked out and I just backed it down even more to lower the exposure. Now when I brought it into post, I didn't clip anything. I did have a little bit more headroom. So there was just a little bit of a disconnect there between what the histogram was showing and what was showing on the screen. Now I did have the view assist turned on, and I probably should have also checked it with the view assist turned off, but there's a little bit of disconnect there. I think there's a little bit of a learning curve. In terms of the battery life on this camera does have a pretty big battery. It's their like full-size battery here. I didn't even burn a half a battery. I was out shooting for 2 hours. Now, I did turn the camera on and off quite a bit, but I had no issue with batteries. The next thing I want to mention is the startup time. It is insanely fast on this camera, which I love. So here we go. Let me turn this on. Boom. That's it. Off. Let me turn it back on. It is super quick. I love that, especially when you're doing quick shooting out on the street or whatever. I love having a quick startup time. I did want to also point out that the EVF, which I use mostly today when I was shooting outside, it was a little bit laggy, and I don't know if there's a way to increase the frame rate in the EVF. I couldn't find it in the menu system, but it didn't seem completely smooth, and I was shooting in 24 frames per second, but I don't know, I just wanted to point that out. It was totally usable, but it was just a little bit laggy. Next, let's talk about the physical design a little bit, because it's kind of a big part of this camera. Now, in terms of the grip, there is this little bump right here, which kind of you put your fingers on, but it could basically be flat. This didn't really help too much. I kind of felt like I was kind of clawing it and gripping it pretty hard. I am used to having cameras that have a much larger grip on them, so that was something to get used to. I don't know if you can add a cage or a grip to this or something like that, but a big part of this has to do with the design of the camera, this retro feel. I definitely felt like I was going to drop it a few times. I did not drop it, but it's something to be aware of. Maybe wear a wrist strap or a neck strap or something like that. Now let's talk about some of the dials and stuff, because that's what's super cool about this. Now, I love the dials. I really do. Some of them are useful. Some of them are not for me for shooting video. The ISO dial is awesome because I can just leave it at 800 and I don't have to think about it and I don't have to bump it. This is pretty sturdy in there, but you can switch it if you want to, but I didn't bump it at all while I was out shooting and left it on 800. Now over here is the shutter speed, and this one actually I couldn't use because I needed to set it to 1/50 for 24 frames per second, but the options are 30 and 60, so I couldn't set it to 1/50. So I actually had to set this to the 1/3 step, and you can hear it click in, and then it locks, and then you can control it with the camera. So in terms of the camera control, on the back here, I set this one to aperture, and on the front, I set this one to shutter speed. There's a couple other things to point out here. If I turn this on, there is a little screen here, and that is the aperture. It's a little small, but you can see that in there. That's kind of cool. On the back, you kind of have your normal controls here. One thing is you don't have a dial here on the back, but this I usually set to ISO, and like I said, the ISO worked really well over here. In terms of ports, I didn't use anything today, but we do have a USB port, headphone, micro HDMI, and a 3.5 mic jack. Now onto the bottom, I know I was just in here talking about the battery, but there are 2 card slots. There is an SD card slot and a micro SD card slot. So a little bit unorthodox, but you still get 2 card slots, so you can still do a backup or whatever. I was just using an SD card slot today. No issues whatsoever. So this wraps up my first impressions of the Nikon ZF for shooting video. What I used to do when I got a new camera was I'd do a whole series of videos doing deep dives into all the technical aspects of the camera, comparisons, all that kind of stuff. And I think I'm going to get back into that routine. So there will be a bunch of videos following about the Nikon ZF and all of its technical aspects. So if you're interested in that, make sure you hit subscribe. All right, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.